Hello class and welcome to week 2. This week we're going to be looking at our biases, and before we really delve into biases, I wanted to talk about the headset that I'm wearing. I received feedback that it was difficult to hear me with just those earbuds, and so hence the headset. Now, as we look into our biases, the quote I selected for us this week comes from Brian Greene. He's an astrophysicist, a very brilliant man, and also he writes about physics and quantum physics and the multiverse and all these very complicated topics in language that's easy for dummies. And so I really like his work, but this particular quote I think really gets at the heart of what we're getting at this week. When we think about our biases and sort of why we have biases or why we make assumptions about certain things, we have to ask bold questions and accept the answers. The answers being that these are things we might have learned in our childhood or just things we've picked up from the media along the way. That doesn't make them right or wrong. It just means that this is a sort of a knee-jerk reaction, and really setting that aside and encountering a person as they are, it's what's most important. You might remember from your residency experience when you did the cultural bias activity, and before that, I hope that you all really took part in the implicit association test, and I will provide that in this course at some point, but it really helps us to get in touch with some of the biases that we hold about people, about things, about ideas, etc. And as counselors, I think that it's important for you to understand and recognize, and counselors in training, recognize what your particular biases may be. Because as you see in chapter 7, which chapter 7 is an extremely important chapter in your book, and I really stress that the importance of reading it. In chapter 7, there is a case from a man named Kevin. As we see in Kevin's case, and as you'll see this week, as counselors, our biases can come out in sort of insidious ways. It's not always extremely overt. You'll learn about microaggressions. Sometimes our biases aren't overt and over the top. Sometimes it's a microaggression. It's something that we might say or a facial expression we might make, or in Kevin's case, completely not even seeing what the issue may be because we think it's a completely different issue. And so this is why it's important to really understand and work on and figure out and be honest with yourself about where your biases come from so that you won't be encumbered when you're working with a client. A couple of things. I want to let you all know that I have been completely humbled by your videos, very much appreciative of the vulnerability that you all took in discussing your feelings of otherness. Please look forward to my feedback this week, along with my feedback on your journals and on your first case. This week you have due another journal entry about your biases and a discussion about your biases. The last thing I'm going to say about this week is in chapter 7 there is an article, a seminal article. Every student who's gone through a diversity in counseling class has read Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I remember when I was a master's student and I read this article, I to this day remember the visceral reaction I had when I read this article and the reaction of my classmates. It is different if you've never really read this article before, and especially in our political climate today in America, especially where we talk about privilege or we attempt to talk about privilege and people get extremely offended. It's important to read this text, which I believe was written in 1988, and see where she's coming from in terms of what privilege is, and really be honest with ourselves about the ways in which we are privileged. And so I just encourage you to really read chapter 7. It's a rich chapter. It has a lot of good information in it, and take part in the activities of this week. The last thing I'll say about biases is I think oftentimes when we think about working with clients who are different from us, it's very easy for us to put ourselves in the position of the victim. A lot of you and your otherness, a lot of our otherness exercises really honed in on experiences when we felt less than or excluded, when we felt like, we weren't treated fairly, and that gives you compassion for the victim. Here's a story that happened when I was in my master's program that always helps me to keep my biases in check. When I was in my master's program is when Hurricane Katrina happened, and that was back in 2006. And in class, we're watching this real time. We were listening to an NPR interview with residents in New Orleans. I've never been to New Orleans, but apparently, from what I could gather from the article, in New Orleans there is a bridge that sort of separates the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods from the higher socioeconomic neighborhoods. And apparently, the bridge is also what leads people to higher ground. And in this NPR interview, a lot of the residents who were in the areas that were flooding, who were people of lower socioeconomic status, were walking across the bridge, were attempting to get from lower ground to higher ground where they would be safe. So many of these individuals were people of color, were minorities, and they're walking up the bridge to get to higher ground, to get to dry land where they would be safe. And they are met on the bridge by the sheriff, who has guns pointed at them, telling them to turn around and go back where they came from. Now, in class, we were all extremely outraged, and my professor, who is a dear friend to this day, she stands in front of the class and she says, "Okay, how many of you think that you could work with some of these people who were, sent back home?" And everybody's hand shot up like, I can. Then my professor flips the script on us and says, "Now what about the sheriff? What about the individual who's holding the gun? Is this a person that you could work with?" And so at that point, and even to this day, I have to call myself on the carpet and have to understand that everyone has a story, that I have biases. I think it's easy for us to empathize with the individual that we perceive as being the victim. But oftentimes, there are more individuals in a story, and everyone has one. So those are my announcements for the week. Sorry it went a little long. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks.